I think my role as someone who's in the middle of both still being a storyteller and an academic is to like consume all of these books, eat them all, eat these theories and philosophies, and then spew them out into a book that is a story, that is accessible, that is familiar. And I would say Johnny is kind of the mishmash of a lot of research that I have done and am doing around, indigenous concepts of gender, sex, and sexuality, and the resurgence of what we might call like two-spirit studies now. Um, it is an amalgamation of all of that, but it's just infused into kind of the most literary real lives of these characters who I also, as an author, it is fiction, but I think as an indigenous author, as a queer indigenous author, and I think BIPOC authors at large, the body of text is like umbilically tied to the body of the writer. We like feed each other like regurgitant birds almost.
Lovely.
So it's also infused with the personal and the fictional. And I think for me, like that's my role as a storyteller, is just to like be a voracious eater of literature, a voracious eater of theory and philosophy, and then, a fierce listener. And that's what crafts character. And if you can infuse all of that, I think that's the perfect medium. And yeah, I tell my students all the time, like writing an academic essay is poetics. we're doing the same thing. It's just the division that the Academy has between creative writing and critical writing. And that division to me is, if I'm going to be decolonial in the land and not recognize, provincial and territorial and national borders, I also try to do that in my creative practices as well, disregarding, the borders of creative, critical, fiction, nonfiction. A good story is just a good story. And if you can amalgamate all of them to something, it becomes a powerful story, a very, very strong tool of transformation. And I think my situation in between both of these fields really allows me to do that. I was working on a short story, or this novel idea that I had about, called The Concrete Poets, and it was about these very existential, philosophical, indigenous pool hall sharks who, would basically hustle people at the pool hall and make a bunch of money and use that to buy a couple pitchers of beer, and they'd all go back to this kind of artistic frat house where they played piano and smoke weed into the hours of the night, had all of these very existential stream of consciousness talks, which sometimes hinged on what non-indigenous Western culture might call speculative fiction or fantasy, but thinking about our own indigenous worldviews where we very much pay tribute to the non-human and the spiritual as well. But it was all about that. It never worked. It was I think I learned in creative writing classes in high school and in my undergrad, and as I continued throughout, of being like force-fed gluttonously the canon, which is primarily, heterosexual, cisgendered white men, that I was like so trained to write white for so long, and it took me a long time to undo that. So that never worked. But there was a tertiary character in that story whose name was Johnny, and who was very flamboyant, beloved, but wasn't a pool hall shark, was just a very good hustler of words, I guess I would say, and was very much able to, seduce, but also attract. And he was beloved, but he was kind of on the peripheries. So I cut that story, but I never forgot about that one character. And then I was writing Full Metal Indigiqueer, which is a kind of a speculative fiction poetry collection about a trickster cyborg. And I had these very sensual beach poems, which didn't fit with like the automaton of kind of the form of the book. And I was working with Niska poet Jordan Abel, who had me cut them, and I did. And I saved them in my files because I'm also a literary hoarder, I guess we could say. And then I was here at the University of Calgary, starting this class entitled 100 Pages in 100 Days. It was just as exhausting as it sounds.
Wow.
And I had to make this portfolio. So I had these beach poems. I knew I wanted to use them for something. And lo and behold, and I called Johnny a diva and a glitter princess because he always fights for, the center stage. And I swear, like this little glitter princess just like sashay to the middle of like my creative mind with these beach poems on my table, and me thinking, what do I do with these? And was like, give me a shot. So I popped him in, and those became the very early scenes of him and Tias as children in Grand Beach, Manitoba. And then the story just unfurled and unfurled. So he began as a short story. We did the 100 pages. He became a novella. And in full Jonny fashion, he was like, I am not finished, so don't put that pen down. And I had a writing retreat in Banff for 2 weeks in one of the latent artist colony, or center now it's called. And from there, it's a fever dream, just like the book is, of like writing from 9 a.m. until like 1 in the morning. And he became the full novel that he is in that semblance. I think like that's the great thing of genre, really, of horror, of speculative fiction. And I was just talking with some folks about the popularity of COVID popular media or popular culture. I think each like little wave or iteration has had its phenomenon, from the Tiger King through to now we have Yellow Jackets and Euphoria, very dystopian post. We can consider them post-apocalyptic now, and I think it's because why like that, as well as speculative fiction or genre, more importantly, I think it's because we're always itching to know what happens after the end, and I think that's a very humanistic question to wrestle with. Like, what happens after we die? What happens after this relationship ends? What happens after this? And it's a yearning and a hunger, and I think speculative fiction specifically gets to some of the questions, or at least projects futures that we can imagine ourselves into. And if we can imagine ourselves into it, we can build it as well. And I think like that's what literature does, specifically speculative fiction, is it lays roadmaps. Even looking at historical fiction like H.G. Wells, some of the things that were futuristic are now things we have. So it's almost like, I guess, like scrying or foresight that I think speculative fiction offers. And in this one specifically, Love After the End, it began as, let's write dystopian literature, let's write dystopian short stories. And I didn't want to do that as the editor, specifically because thinking about history repeating itself just with different names, I was like, we've already survived, 10, 11, 12 different apocalypses already as Indigenous people, and specifically as queer or trans. Let's imagine utopia. What does joy look like instead of always focusing on trauma? How can we like bloom into being? And how can we become, how do we become good ancestors in imagining that? So it was important for me too to think about utopia rather than dystopia, because we live in a time of dystopian presence. We live in a time of trauma and sorrow and mourning. And I want for us to imagine a horizon that is rich with possibility. And utopia and speculative fiction, I think, offer us that in Love After the End.